If you die tonight, I'm going to make sure the person holding that phone dies with you. The voice on the other end of the line didn't sound like a father. It sounded like a thunderstorm trapped in a human chest, deep, cold, and terrifying. Hello, my wonderful friends. It is so good to have you here with us today. Before we dive into this incredible journey of courage and hidden secrets, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Whether you are in the busy streets of London, the warm breeze of Jamaica, or anywhere in the US or Canada, please drop a comment and say hi. And if you haven't joined our family yet, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world to us and helps us keep telling these stories. Now, let's go back to that dark, lonely street. Ilara didn't know about power. She didn't know about empires or the families that ran the city from the shadows. To her, power was having enough coins in her pocket to buy a warm patty for dinner and a bus pass that didn't expire until Friday. Ilara was 19, with skin the color of warm caramel and a crown of thick, dark curls that she kept tied back with a piece of old ribbon. Her hazel eyes were usually bright, but tonight, they were wide with a fear she had never felt before. She was standing in a narrow alleyway just off a busy London street, where the rain had turned the dust into a slick, black oil. At her feet lay a young man who looked like he belonged in a different world. He had pale skin that looked almost like marble under the dim yellow street lamp, and his messy jet-black hair was soaked through. His clothes, a thick black wool coat and expensive leather boots, cost more than Ilara's rent for an entire year. But as he lay there, shaking and gasping for air, all that money didn't matter. "Dad," he whispered. It was a tiny, broken sound. "Please, Dad." Ilara knelt in the dirt, ruining her only pair of jeans. She didn't care. She reached out and touched his forehead. He was burning up, yet he was shivering so hard his teeth were clicking together. "Hey, stay with me," Ilara said, her voice soft but urgent. "I'm here. I'm not going to leave you." She saw a phone lying a few inches away. The screen was cracked, but it was still glowing. On the display, a contact name was pulled up, Dad. Without thinking, she swiped the screen and put the phone to her ear. The man who answered didn't say hello. He didn't ask who was calling. He simply waited. The silence on the other end was so heavy it made Ilara's heart race against her ribs like a trapped bird. Hello?" Ilara stammered. "I found your son. He's in a bad way. He's collapsed on the street near the old train station. You need to come quickly." There was a long pause. When the voice finally came, it was like a knife sliding across silk. "Who is this?" the man asked. His voice was older, rough, and carried a weight that made Ilara want to drop the phone and run. "And what kind of game are you playing? If Julian sent you to ask for money again, tell him the answer is no." "This isn't a game." Ilara cried out, her voice cracking as she watched Julian's eyes roll back in his head. "He's shaking. He can't breathe right. He's calling for you. Please, he's dying." "Listen to me carefully, girl," the man said, and Ilara could almost feel his cold, grey eyes staring at her through the speaker. "I don't know who you are, but I have a very long reach. If this is a setup, if there is a single person waiting in that alley with a weapon, you will not live to see the sun rise. Do you understand me?" Ilara looked down at Julian. He had reached out a pale, trembling hand and gripped the sleeve of her faded denim jacket. His grip was weak, but he wouldn't let go. He looked so small, so lost. "I don't care about your threats," Ilara whispered into the phone, tears finally stinging her eyes. "I'm just a girl who doesn't want to see a son die alone in the rain. Come or don't. But I'm staying with him." She hung up the phone and pulled Julian's head into her lap, wrapping her jacket around his shoulders to stop the shivering. She had no idea that she had just challenged the most dangerous man in the country. She had no idea that by picking up that phone, she had just walked into a war that had been brewing since before she was born. She only knew that the boy was cold, and she was the only one there to keep him warm. Would the father really come? Or had Ilara just signed her own death warrant by calling a man who saw everyone as an enemy? The rain didn't stop, and neither did the shaking. Ilara sat there on the cold ground, her back pressed against a damp brick wall, holding a stranger as if he were her own brother. To anyone else passing by, she was just another invisible girl on the streets of London, someone to be ignored or avoided. But Ilara was used to being invisible. Since her mother had passed away 3 years ago, Ilara had learned that the world was a very big, very cold place for a girl with no last name that mattered. She lived in a tiny room in a boarding house that smelled of old cabbage and damp wood. She worked 3 different jobs: cleaning a bakery at dawn, delivering packages at noon, and scrubbing the floors of a local gym at night. Her deepest dream wasn't to be a princess or a billionaire. She just wanted a door she could lock and a kitchen where the cupboards weren't always empty. She looked down at Julian. Up close, even through the grime, he was beautiful in a way that felt painful. His skin was so pale it was almost translucent, and his eyelashes were thick and dark against his cheeks. He looked like someone who had never had to worry about a bus fare, yet the sadness etched into the corners of his mouth told a different story. "Why were you out here all alone?" she whispered, smoothing his wet hair away from his forehead. Suddenly, the sound of screeching tires broke the silence of the alley. 2 massive, black SUVs roared to a halt at the entrance, their headlights cutting through the darkness like the eyes of giant beasts. Ilara shielded her eyes, her heart hammering. A man stepped out of the lead vehicle. He was tall, moving with a controlled grace that reminded Ilara of a panther. He wore a charcoal gray suit that looked like it cost more than the cars on her street. His hair was salt and pepper, cropped short, and his gray eyes were like 2 pieces of sharpened steel. This was the man from the phone. This was the boss. He didn't run. He walked with a terrifying calmness. Behind him, 4 large men in black suits fanned out, their hands resting near their belts. When the boss reached Ilara, he stopped. He looked down at her tattered jacket, her messy bun, and her hazel eyes that refused to look away. Then, his gaze shifted to Julian. For a split second, the steel in his eyes flickered. A tiny crack appeared in his mask of ice. "Julian," he said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command. One of the large men stepped forward to grab Ilara's shoulder, to toss her aside like trash, but the boss held up a hand. "Wait." He knelt down, his expensive suit trousers hitting the dirty pavement. He didn't seem to notice the mud. He reached out and touched Julian's neck, checking for a pulse. His heavy gold signet ring caught the light. "He's been poisoned," the boss muttered, more to himself than to her. "The cowards couldn't face him, so they used a needle." He finally looked at Ilara. "You stayed. Why?" Most people in this neighborhood would have stolen his watch and left him to bleed out. Ilara wiped a stray tear from her cheek. "Because he was calling for his dad," she said simply. "Nobody should have to call for someone who doesn't show up." The boss stared at her for a long beat. He saw the hunger in her thin frame, the exhaustion in her eyes, but he also saw a spine made of iron. He saw a girl who had nothing, yet she was protecting his son, the son who had run away from him 2 years ago to escape the blood and the shadows. "What is your name, girl?" "Ilara," she replied, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Well, Ilara," the boss said, standing up and nodding to his men to lift Julian. "You've just become the most important witness in this city. And in my world, witnesses are either protected or eliminated. Since you saved my blood, I suppose I'll have to choose the former." Before Ilara could protest, she was being ushered toward the black SUV. She looked back at the dark alley, the only home she knew, and felt a strange shiver. She had spent her life trying to be seen, and now, the most dangerous man in the world was looking right at her. "Wait." Ilara cried as they reached the car. "I have a job. I have to be at the bakery in 4 hours." The boss didn't even turn around as he climbed into the back seat where Julian was being laid out. "You don't have a job anymore, Ilara. You have a life to save." And if my son doesn't wake up, you'll find that the streets were much safer than my hospitality. As the door slammed shut and the engine roared to life, Elara realized she wasn't just a girl from the streets anymore. She was a guest of a monster, and the golden cage was about to close. The black SUV moved through the rain-slicked streets of the city like a ghost. Inside, the air smelled of expensive leather and something metallic, like old coins and cold sweat. Elara sat huddled in the corner of the plush seat, her hands tucked into the sleeves of her denim jacket. She watched the boss. He didn't look like a man who was worried. He looked like a man who was calculating the price of a life. They pulled up to a massive estate hidden behind high stone walls and iron gates that opened silently, like the jaws of a giant. This wasn't just a house, it was a fortress. Men with earpieces stood at every corner, their eyes scanning the darkness. "Get him to the medical wing. Now," the boss commanded as the doors opened. A team of people in white coats, doctors who clearly worked for the family in secret, rushed out with a stretcher. They whisked Julian away, his pale face looking even more ghostly under the bright floodlights of the driveway. Elara stood on the gravel, feeling completely out of place. She looked at her dirty sneakers and then at the marble pillars of the mansion. She turned to leave, thinking she had done her part, but a heavy hand landed on her shoulder. It was one of the guards, a man with a scarred face and eyes that didn't blink. "The boss isn't finished with you," the man said. She was led into a massive study filled with walls of books and a desk made of dark, heavy wood. The boss was standing by the window, his back to her. He had taken off his suit jacket, revealing a holster strapped to his side. He turned around, holding a glass of amber liquid. "My son is stable, for now," he said, his gray eyes pinning her to the spot. "The doctors say the toxin was slow-acting. If you hadn't called when you did, his heart would have stopped before midnight." "I'm glad he's okay," Elara said, her voice small. "Can I go home now?" The boss let out a short, dry laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Go home? To that hole in the wall? Elara, the people who did this to Julian saw you. They saw a girl with caramel skin and a denim jacket talking on his phone. In their eyes, you are a partner. If you walk out those gates, you won't make it to the end of the block." Elara's breath hitched. "But I don't even know him. I just found him." "It doesn't matter what the truth is," the boss said, stepping closer. "It matters what it looks like. You're staying here. For your safety, and for his. Julian, he's a stubborn boy. He hates this life. He hates me. But when he was dying, he held onto your arm like you were his only anchor. I want to know why." Just then, a woman burst into the room. She was elegant, with pale skin and blonde hair pulled into a tight, perfect bun. She wore a silk dress that shimmered like pearls. This was Clara, the boss's sister, and the look she gave Elara was pure venom. "Who is this gutter rat, Silas?" Clara hissed, pointing a manicured finger at Elara. "And why is she in our home?" "She saved Julian's life, Clara," Silas, the boss, said coldly. "She stays until I say otherwise. She's a liability." Clara snapped. "Look at her. She probably set the whole thing up to get a reward." Elara felt a spark of anger overcome her fear. "I didn't ask for a reward. I was just trying to help a boy who was dying while people like you probably would have just stepped over him." The room went silent. Silas looked at Elara with a strange expression, not anger, but a weird kind of respect. No one talked back to Clara. But the real shock came a moment later. A young man stepped into the doorway, leaning heavily on a cane. It was Julian. He was weak, his face still pale, but his blue eyes were wide as they landed on Elara. "You," he whispered. "Julian, go back to bed." Clara rushed toward him, but he pushed her hand away. He walked, limped, toward Elara. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled photograph. It was old and yellowed at the edges. He held it up next to Elara's face, his hand shaking. Silas stepped forward, curious. He looked at the photo, then at Elara, then back at the photo. His face went completely white, the grey of his eyes turning to ash. The photo showed a younger Silas, smiling, a look no one had seen in decades, standing next to a beautiful woman with caramel skin and a crown of dark curls. She was holding a baby girl with hazel eyes. "Where did you get that jacket, Elara?" Silas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Elara touched the faded denim of her sleeve. "It was my mother's. It's all I have left of her. Her name was Maya." Silas dropped his glass. It shattered on the marble floor, the amber liquid spreading like a wound. He looked at Elara as if he were seeing a ghost. "Maya wasn't just a woman I knew," Silas said, his voice trembling for the first time. "She was the woman I was supposed to protect. And the baby in that photo, she was supposed to be dead." The world seemed to tilt. Elara looked at the photo. The woman looked exactly like her. The baby had her eyes. "What are you saying?" Elara whispered, her heart stopping. Silas looked her in the eye, the most dangerous man in the city now looking like he had been struck by lightning. "I'm saying that 20 years ago, I made a mistake that destroyed a family. I thought I lost everything that night. But it seems the girl from the street didn't just save my son. She might have just brought back the daughter I thought was in a grave." The room felt like it was spinning. Clara's face was twisted in horror. Julian was looking at Elara with a mix of shock and hope, and Elara felt like the floor had finally disappeared beneath her feet. She wasn't just a stranger. She was the secret Silas had buried, and her presence in this house was about to set off a bomb that would change the mafia empire forever. The silence in the study was so thick you could hear the rain tapping against the bulletproof glass like tiny hammers. Elara felt cold, a deep, biting cold that had nothing to do with her wet clothes. She stared at the photo in Julian's trembling hand. The woman in the picture had her nose, her smile, and the same wild curls that Elara struggled to brush every morning. "You're lying," Elara whispered, backing away until her heels hit the edge of a heavy rug. "My mother was a seamstress. She worked 3 jobs to keep us in a tiny apartment in Jamaica before we moved here. She never mentioned a man like you. She never mentioned this." Silas didn't move. He looked older now, the fierce boss mask crumbling. "Maya fled because she had to. I was a different man then, Elara. I was rising through the ranks, making enemies of everyone. One night, a rival family set fire to the house where I had hidden her and the baby. My men told me no one survived. I spent 20 years believing I was the reason my heart was buried in the ground." "Silas, stop this nonsense." Clara's voice cut through the air like a jagged blade. She stepped between her brother and Elara, her blonde hair shimmering under the chandelier. "This is clearly a scam. This girl is a street urchin. She probably stole that jacket or found the photo. You're letting your guilt blind you." Julian, still leaning on his cane, narrowed his eyes at his aunt. "I found the photo in your private safe, Aunt Clara. While I was looking for my passport to run away last month. Why did you have it? Why did you tell Dad they were dead if you had proof they weren't?" Clara's face turned a ghostly shade of white, but she quickly recovered. "I kept it as a memento of Silas's past failures. To remind him why we must stay strong." The tension in the room was a living thing. Silas looked at his sister, a dark suspicion blooming in his grey eyes, but before he could speak, Julian stumbled. Elara instinctively moved forward, catching his arm. Even though she was reeling from the shock of the photo, her heart couldn't ignore someone in pain. Their eyes met, caramel brown meeting haunted blue. "Thank you," Julian breathed. Despite the madness, a strange, quiet spark flickered between them. It wasn't the kind of love you read about in books. It was the bond of 2 people who had both been abandoned by the world in different ways. "Take them both to the West Wing," Silas commanded, his voice returning to its iron tone, though it lacked its usual bite. "Elara, you will stay in the guest suite next to Julian. I'm sending a specialized team to run a DNA test. Until the results come, no one enters or leaves those rooms without my permission. As they were led away, Elara felt like she was walking through a dream. The mansion was a maze of gold-leafed mirrors and silent, armed men. She was given a room larger than her entire boarding house. A maid brought her soft, silk pajamas and a warm meal, but Elara couldn't eat. She sat by the window, looking out at the sprawling gardens, wondering if her whole life had been a lie. A soft knock came at the connecting door. It was Julian. He had changed into a clean shirt, and though he was still pale, he looked more like a person and less like a ghost. "I'm sorry," he said, sitting on the edge of a velvet chair, "for dragging you into this. My father, he's a hard man. But he's been a hollow shell since I can remember. If you really are who that photo says you are, you're the only light this family has left." "I don't want to be a light," Elara said, her voice cracking. "I just want to know who I am. My mom died thinking she was alone. Why didn't he find us? Why did he let us live in poverty while he sat in this palace?" "Maybe he didn't know," Julian whispered. "Or maybe someone made sure he never found out." Over the next 2 days, an uneasy peace settled. Elara spent her hours with Julian. They talked for hours, not about the mafia or the money, but about small things. He told her about his dream of becoming a painter, far away from the blood of his father's business. She told him about the smell of the bakery at 4 a.m. and the way the sun looked over the ocean back in Jamaica. She found herself laughing at his dry wit, and he found himself smiling, a real, genuine smile, for the first time in years. The trauma of the street was being replaced by a budding, tender affection. But the shadows were closing in. On the third night, Elara was walking to the kitchen for a glass of water when she heard hushed, angry voices coming from the library. She paused, pressing her back against the cool marble wall. "The test results come back tomorrow, Clara," a man's voice whispered. It was one of Silas's top lieutenants, a man named Victor. "If she's his daughter, she becomes the heir. Everything we've worked for, the move to take over the empire, it all vanishes. She won't be the heir." Clara's voice was cold and deadly. "Because she won't be alive to hear the results. We handle it tonight. Make it look like she tried to rob the place and the guards reacted. Silas will be heartbroken, but he'll move on." Elara's blood turned to ice. Her heart hammered so loud she was sure they could hear it. She wasn't just a long-lost daughter, she was a target. She turned to run back to Julian, but as she rounded the corner, she bumped into a solid chest. A hand clamped over her mouth, and a cold, metal barrel pressed against her temple. "Going somewhere, princess?" Victor sneered, his eyes glinting with malice. The metal of the gun was freezing against Elara's skin, a sharp contrast to the warm, humid air of the mansion's hallway. Victor's grip was like an iron vice, his fingers bruising her jaw. He began to drag her toward the back service stays, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and expensive whiskey. "You should have stayed in the gutter, girl," Victor hissed. "You would have lived longer." Elara's mind raced. She wasn't a fighter, but she was a survivor. She had spent years dodging aggressive drunks at the gym she cleaned and outrunning bullies in the alleyways. As they reached the top of the darkened stairwell, she went limp, making herself a dead weight. Victor stumbled, his balance shifting, and in that split second, Elara drove her elbow back with every ounce of strength she had. She hit his ribs with a sickening thud. He gasped, his grip loosening just enough for her to bite down hard on his hand. He roared in pain, and Elara bolted. She didn't run for the front door. She knew the guards there belonged to Silas, or worse, to Victor. She ran toward Julian's room. She burst through the connecting door, gasping for air. Julian was sitting up in bed, a sketchbook in his lap. He dropped it as he saw her face. "Elara? What happened?" "They're coming for me," she panted, locking the door behind her. "Victor and your aunt. They're going to kill me before the DNA results come back. Julian, we have to get to your father." Julian stood up, his face hardening. The sickly boy from the sidewalk was gone, replaced by a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. He grabbed a heavy silver letter opener from his nightstand. It wasn't much, but it was steel. "The back way," Julian whispered. "Through the gallery. My father is in the vault room tonight, checking the ledgers." They moved through the darkened halls, shadows dancing on the walls. But as they reached the grand gallery, the lights flickered and died. The emergency red lights kicked in, bathing the room in a bloody, eerie glow. "Silas won't help you," a voice echoed through the room. Clara stepped out from behind a marble statue of a weeping angel. She wasn't wearing her silk dress anymore. She wore a sharp, black trench coat, and she held a silenced pistol with practiced ease. "Aunt Clara, stop this!" Julian shouted, stepping in front of Elara. "She's family. You saw the photo." Clara laughed, a high, brittle sound. "Family? Julian, you've always been too soft. Like your father used to be. Silas loved that woman, Maya. He loved her so much he was going to walk away from the business. He was going to give it all up, the power, the money, the legacy. I couldn't let that happen." Elara's heart stopped. "What did you do?" Clara smiled, and for the first time, Elara saw the true monster in the house. It wasn't the man with the gun, it was the woman with the plan. "I didn't just keep the photo, Elara," Clara said, stepping closer, the red light glinting off her eyes. "I tipped off the rivals 20 years ago. I told them exactly where Maya was hiding. I watched that house burn. I thought I had cleared the path for Silas to become the king he was meant to be. You tried to kill my mother." Elara's voice was a low, dangerous growl. The fear was being swallowed by a white-hot rage. "You tried to kill a baby. And I'm going to finish the job tonight," Clara said, raising the gun. "No, you're not." The voice came from the shadows at the far end of the gallery. Silas stepped into the red light. He looked devastated, his shoulders slumped, but his eyes were filled with a terrifying, cold fire. In his hand, he held a small electronic tablet. "The DNA results just hit my inbox, Clara," Silas said, his voice trembling with a mix of grief and fury. "She is mine. Elara is my daughter. And I heard every word you just said." Clara's hand shook, the gun wavering between Silas and Elara. "I did it for the family, Silas. You were going to leave us. I saved the empire. You destroyed my soul." Silas roared, stepping forward. "You let me live in a desert of grief for 20 years while my daughter grew up in the dirt. You are no sister of mine." In a desperate move, Clara turned the gun toward Elara, her face twisted in a mask of hate. "If I can't have the empire, no one will." Thwip. A single muffled shot echoed through the gallery. But it wasn't Clara who fired. Silas had pulled a small backup piece from his waistband. Clara gasped, a small red bloom appearing on her shoulder, and she fell back against the statue, her gun clattering to the floor. Silas didn't look at his sister as she slumped to the ground. He ran. He ran past the statues and the gold, falling to his knees in front of Elara. "Forgive me," he choked out, reaching out a hand he didn't feel worthy to touch her with. "My daughter, my beautiful girl. I am so sorry." Elara looked at the man who was the most feared person in the city, now sobbing at her feet. She looked at Julian, who was watching them with tears in his eyes. The truth was out, but the pain was only just beginning. The empire was fractured, the secrets were buried, and the girl who had nothing now had a father she wasn't sure she could ever love. The revelation of the DNA results didn't bring the peace Elara expected. Instead, the mansion felt like it was suffocating. While Clara was hauled away to a private medical wing that was really a prison, the vacuum she left behind created a storm. Victor, Silas's top lieutenant, hadn't disappeared. He had seen the Empire's weakness. To the men in the shadows, Silas was no longer a feared titan, he was a father distracted by a long-lost daughter. I can't stay here, Julian, Ilara whispered 2 nights later. She was standing in the grand library, her fingers tracing the spine of a book. She was wearing a beautiful silk dress the color of the Jamaican sunset, but she felt like a bird in a cage. Every time I look at your father, I see the man who let my mother live in fear. I see the world that tried to kill me. Julian walked toward her, his limp barely noticeable now. His trying, Ilara. His torn down every photo of the old business. His purging the ranks. His doing it for you. But at what cost? Ilara asked. The answer came in the form of an explosion. The ground shook as a massive blast rocked the front gates. Alarms began to blare, a high, piercing scream that cut through the night. They're here, Julian gasped. Victor had moved faster than anyone expected. He had teamed up with the rival families, the very ones who had burned Ilara's childhood home. They weren't just coming for the money, they were coming to wipe out the bloodline. In the chaos, the power was cut. The mansion fell into a terrifying, pitch-black silence. Ilara felt a hand grab her arm in the dark. Julian, she whispered, her heart hammering. No, a rough voice answered. A heavy cloth was pressed over her face. It smelled of chemicals, sweet and sickly. Ilara fought, kicking and scratching, but the world began to spin. The last thing she saw was the red glow of the emergency lights reflecting off the steel eyes of Victor. When she woke up, she wasn't in a mansion. She was back in an alleyway, or somewhere that smelled like one. Her hands were zip-tied behind her back. She was sitting in a rusted chair in the middle of a cold, damp warehouse. Across from her, Silas was tied to a similar chair. He was beaten, his charcoal suit torn and stained with blood. He looked up, his grey eyes filling with a devastating agony when he saw her. Ilara, no, he groaned. Victor stepped out of the shadows, holding a phone. I've sent the video to the boy, Silas. Julian is on his way. He thinks he's coming to negotiate. But we both know how this ends. I'm going to kill the girl, then the son, and then I'm going to let you live just long enough to watch me take your throne. Take it all. Silas screamed, his voice breaking. Take the money, the docks, the houses. Just let her go. She has nothing to do with this. She is your heart, Silas, Victor sneered, pressing the barrel of a gun to Ilara's temple. And I've always wanted to see you go through life without a heart. Ilara looked at Silas. In this darkest hour, she didn't see a mafia boss. She didn't see a monster. She saw a man who was willing to die for a daughter he had only just met. And for the first time, she didn't feel like an orphan. The sound of a lone car engine echoed outside the warehouse. Julian had arrived. He's alone, just like you asked, one of Victor's men shouted. Victor grinned. Bring him in. Let's make this a family reunion. Julian walked into the light of the warehouse. He wasn't carrying a gun. He was carrying a small, black briefcase. He looked terrified, his pale skin almost blue under the flickering industrial lights, but his eyes were fixed on Ilara. I have the offshore codes, Victor, Julian said, his voice trembling. Everything. The Swiss accounts, the Cayman holdings. It's over $400 million. It's all yours. Just let them go. Victor gestured for Julian to bring the case forward. As Julian walked past a stack of wooden crates, he tripped. The briefcase flew open, and bundles of cash spilled across the floor. You clumsy brat. Victor laughed, looking down at the money. That was the moment. Julian hadn't tripped. He had practiced that move. As he fell, he kicked a hidden lever on a nearby forklift. A massive crate of heavy engine parts, suspended by a frayed rope, came crashing down. It didn't hit Victor, but it smashed into the main power junction of the warehouse. Siark. The warehouse was plunged into total darkness, and the air was suddenly filled with the hiss of escaping steam and the smell of ozone. Now! Julian screamed. In the confusion, Silas, who had been working his ties against a sharp piece of metal on his chair, broke free. He didn't run for the exit. He lunged at Victor in the dark. Ilara felt someone pulling at her zip ties. "I've got you," Julian whispered in her ear. He sliced the plastic with a small pocket knife. "We have to help your father." Ilara cried. "The back door is open. Go." Silas's voice roared through the dark. "Julian, take her and go." But Ilara wouldn't move. She saw the flash of muzzle flares as Victor's men began firing blindly into the shadows. She saw Silas tackle Victor, the two men tumbling into the darkness of the lower pits. "I'm not leaving my family again," Ilara shouted. She grabbed a heavy metal pipe from the floor. She didn't have a gun, and she didn't have training, but she had 19 years of surviving the streets. When a guard ran past her, aiming at Julian, Ilara swung with everything she had. The pipe connected with the guard's knees, and he went down with a howl. Julian grabbed the man's dropped weapon. "Over there." Julian pointed. Silas and Victor were locked in a death grip near the edge of a loading bay. Victor had a knife raised. "Silas, look out." Ilara threw the heavy pipe. It didn't hit Victor, but it struck a stack of metal barrels next to him. The barrels tumbled, creating a thunderous noise that distracted Victor for a split second. It was all the opening Silas needed. He delivered a crushing blow to Victor's jaw and sent him reeling back into the darkness. Silence fell over the warehouse. Silas stood there, panting, his chest heaving. He looked at Julian, then at Ilara. He saw his daughter holding a metal pipe, her caramel skin smudged with grease and blood, her hazel eyes fierce and protective. He didn't see a victim. He saw a warrior. The police sirens began to wail in the distance. Silas's loyalists, the ones who hadn't defected to Victor, swarmed the building, led by the few men Silas still trusted. Victor and his remaining rebels were rounded up, but the real battle was over. They stood outside the warehouse as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The air was cold, but for the first time in days, it felt clean. Silas walked over to Ilara. He looked at her for a long time, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out the signet ring he always wore, the symbol of his power and his bloodline. "I spent my life building a throne made of bones," Silas said softly. "I thought it was the only way to keep what I had. But sitting in that chair, watching that man hold a gun to your head, I realized I don't want a throne. I just want to be the man your mother loved." He took Ilara's hand. He didn't put the ring on her finger. Instead, he dropped it into the deep, dark water of the harbor they were standing next to. "The business is finished," Silas declared. "I've spent the last 48 hours transferring the legal assets to a blind trust. The illegal ones, they've been wiped. I'm turning myself in, Ilara. To fix the past, I have to pay for it." Ilara felt a lump in her throat. "You're going to prison?" "For a while," Silas nodded. "But I've made a deal. I've given the authorities everything they need to take down the rival families for good. In exchange, you and Julian are protected. You'll have enough to start a real life. A clean life." Julian stepped forward, putting an arm around Ilara's shoulder. "We'll wait for you, Dad." Silas smiled, a real, soft smile that made him look like the man in the old photograph. He turned to Ilara. "Before the police get here, there's something I need to tell you. Your mother, Maya, she didn't just flee because she was scared. She fled because she wanted you to be exactly who you are today. Brave. Kind. Better than me." Ilara leaned forward and, for the first time, wrapped her arms around the man she had called a monster just days before. He stiffened in surprise, then melted into the embrace, sobbing quietly into her shoulder. "I'm glad I picked up that phone," Ilara whispered. The sun was shining brightly over a small, colorful house on the coast of Jamaica. The smell of fresh hibiscus and salt air filled the porch. Ilara sat in a wicker chair, a sketchbook in her lap. She wasn't sketching for money anymore, She was sketching because she loved the way the light hit the waves. Her skin had a healthy glow, and her hazel eyes were full of peace. Inside the house, she could hear Julian laughing. He had opened a small art gallery in town, and his paintings, mostly landscapes of the island and portraits of a girl with caramel skin, were already famous among the locals. A car pulled up the gravel driveway. A man stepped out. He looked different. His hair was completely white now, and he wore a simple linen shirt instead of a $5,000 suit. He walked with a slight limp, but his head was held high. Silas had been released early for his cooperation in dismantling the cartels. He had left the grey skies of London behind forever. "Dad!" Ilara called out, dropping her sketchbook and running down the steps. Silas caught her in a hug, swinging her around. "I missed you, my girl." They sat on the porch as the sun began to set, turning the sky into a canvas of pink and gold. They talked about the garden, about Julian's gallery, and about the bakery Ilara was planning to open in the village, a place where no one would ever go hungry. "You know," Silas said, looking out at the ocean, "I used to think that having everything meant owning the world. But I was wrong." He looked at Ilara, then at Julian, who had come out to join them with 3 glasses of cold fruit juice. "Having everything," Silas whispered, "is just having people who would answer the phone when you're falling." The girl who had nothing had found a father. The man who had everything had found his soul. And the boy who wanted to run away had finally found a home. The cycle of blood was broken. In its place, under the warm Jamaican sun, a new story was beginning, one built on hope, justice, and a love that refused to walk away.